Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and I got an interesting premise for you guys. What if we talked about some of the class designs between BFA and a previous expansion? One of the more popular expansions that I've been seeing, at least on the forums, has been Mists of Pandaria. I would think a lot of people would be spamming, oh, Classic WoW was gonna kill BFA, oh, TPC was better than BFA, Wrath of Lich King, I could imagine those. But Mists of Pandaria? I don't really remember Mists of Pandaria being the most exciting expansion. I don't remember everybody on the mother playing it. I do remember that the numbers were at least competitive in terms of sub numbers. They weren't as low as the lowest of WoD, but they weren't even as high as the highest of Kata. So Mists of Pandaria was that weird expansion that you either liked or you either hated. But the thing we'll be talking today, not about the content or the pandas, but rather the class design. What some people have been saying is, back in Mists of Pandaria, the class design was just right. It was perfect, and we should go back to Mists of Pandaria class design compared to BFA. Of course, it's hard to say no, because yes, there has been the prune. We have had prune back in WoD, we have prune back in Legion, and I guess in BFA, did we have prune? I guess some classes got a bit more prune than before, or at least easier to play. But they did give some abilities back, like Hibernate, Soothe, and now Rogues and Hunters have to help tanks with aggro in dungeons, and I guess there's some parts where it is prune, but there's some parts of gameplay that did come back to certain other classes, so it's a kind of give and take, but we'll still count it as a prune regardless. So for the last 3 expansions, we've been having prunes, basic prunes of a bunch of different classes and different specs. So can we go back to Mists of Pandaria? And was Mists of Pandaria class design actually that much better? In this video, I kind of just want to try to come back to some of the older memories of Mists of Pandaria and reminisce about the good old days. Kind of like a throwback video of what classes were like back in Mists of Pandaria. So let's start off with some of the more prominent members of the class design for Mists of Pandaria, like Rogues. And anybody remember Rogues during Season 1 of PvP? No, because they didn't exist. Back in the day, Rogues had such a weird talent set up for their abilities. For the most part, most talents were good except one row where you had to choose between Shadow Step, Burst of Speed, which wasn't the good Burst of Speed, it was the crap one, and Preparation. I don't know who thought that was a good idea, to have prep as a talent option for Rogues, but it was the worst. Eventually they did give us prep back, which thank God they did, but they replaced it with dagger in the back, which Subtlety Rogues would use and abuse until they had to nerf that too. Anyway, at the beginning of Mists of Pandaria, Rogues just didn't have a playable playstyle. All 3 specs dealt, at least in PvP, negligible damage, and I didn't really like that. I mean, of course, Subtlety still had, you know, triple cheap shots that you could use, so you could crowd control the world. All 3 rogue specs had access to Garrote and cheap shots, so you could be a CC bot, and that's what a lot of rogues were for the most part. But most people didn't bring rogues, because first of all, if you had mobility, you were squishy. If you didn't have mobility, well, then you were tanky, but you didn't have mobility, so rogues could be easily kited. Just to give you an idea of the only time Rogues could one-shot somebody in a stun log opener is if you want Preparation as Assassination. Combined with your Dots and Vendetta, you would have Vanish, Ambush as part of your rotation. So that's how bad it was. You had to burn so many cooldowns just to get a good opener on somebody in terms of trying to one-shot them. Because one-shotting wasn't really a thing. Subtlety Rogues, Assassination Rogues, and Combat Rogues were just so behind on damage for everyone. And on top of it, I did play Combat, which was kind of trash tier of Rogues, but I was playing trash tier in trash tier. I did like my 8-second stun and the buff mechanic, but no, even that had some issues too. Alright, that we talked about Rogues, let's talk about a popular spec. We talked about the beta Rogues, let's talk about the Chad, the Warrior. Warriors were literally a mini world boss every time you queued against one in an arena. They would run around and they would mortal strike and overpower you all day long while sitting in defensive stance, which gave them damage reduction. And if they ever got low, Second Wind would always maintain them and keep them up. As soon as they got below 35% health, they would get a heal every second. I believe it was like 3% of their health every second. Back in the day, Rogues had Recoup that gave them 3% every 3 seconds, and Hunters had a Spirit Bond ability where, as long as they have the pet out, they would get a heal every 2 seconds, but 3% every 1 second, I mean, it made you impossible to kill. Combine that with some big defensive cooldowns when you get low, Arms Warriors were actually unbeatable, and they dealt a lot of damage too at the time of Mists of Pandaria. We're not even talking about the big cooldowns, but let's talk about this one buff called Taste for Blood. This is an ability they had at the beginning before they nerfed it in PvP, but they still had it out in the game for so long, it wasn't even funny. So back in the day, Taste for Blood would have an effect where your Mortal Strike also enabled the use of Overpower. In addition, Overpower hits have a 30% chance to enable the use of an additional Overpower, so Overpower proc and more Overpower for itself, and increases the damage of your next Heroic Strike or Cleave within 15 seconds by 100%. This effect stacks up to 5 times. It's a buff that lasted 15 seconds, could not be dispelled or anything, so warriors could maintain it. It came from your Mortal Strikes proccing your Overpower, and if Overpower procs Overpower, you get a stack of 100% more damage, stacking up to 5 times. So essentially, your Heroic Strike could hit up to 500% more damage. And back in Mists of Pandaria, with the normal health numbers, it actually one-shot for full of your health. It was like 160k worth of hit or something. And back in Mists of Pandaria at the beginning, we had like 130 most. So warriors would run around and one-shot everybody with this ability, and eventually they would nerf it down to 3 times in PvP, so that you could only get it stacked up to 3, but it took a while before these nerfs ever came. The ability and the passive lasted for a while, where warriors were able to just enjoy and soak in their glory. Besides Taste for Blood though, they also had another wombo combo, and this wombo combo lasted for a while of Mists of Pandaria. In Battlegrounds, arms warriors could get some easy damage with a combo of Bloodbath Bladestorm. And it's as simple as that. You would combine a talent of Bloodbath, which was a bleed, but you had to stack the bleed up. So depending on how much damage you dealt to an enemy within 10 seconds, the bleed would get higher and higher and higher the more damage you deal, and it had a pass the slow effect. And then you had Bladestorm, which allowed you to, well, Bladestorm, you spin to win, AoEing everybody around you. So in a battleground, you would find a group of enemies, pipe yourself in defensive stance, jump in there, stun them all in AoE, Bloodbath Bladestorm on top of them, maybe throw in a sweeping strike, so some poor chap is just gonna get cleaved the whole time, stacking up the bleed and the damage of Bladestorm even higher. So you would AoE on everybody in an area, and if they ever want to turn on you, you were Wrecking Ball. So they were like, well, let's stop this warrior. We can't really stun him, we can't really do anything, we can only hit him. So if we hit him, we'll just, you know, proc him to 35% health, and then he'll start healing while he's in defensive stance. So a lot of people just had to run out of the way from the warrior, but you are all slowed. It was a perfect death trap, and there's nothing you could do about it. Let's go on to another class that was super strong back in the day, Beastmaster Hunters. They added them the ability of Stampede, which would allow them to have up to 5 pets in an arena or in a BG, and at the beginning, all those pets dealt full damage. So you would have all these pets for a Beastmaster Hunter destroying you, no matter what class you were. You know what was the most popular comp for 2s for a while in the beginning of Mists of Pandaria? Double Beastmaster Hunter. You know what was a more popular comp back in Mists of Pandaria? Triple Beastmaster Hunter. Yeah, and I guess a lot of people would say, oh yeah, it's totally balanced, but triple Beastmaster Hunter. Come on, Blizzard. And I remember this one also took so long. I remember so many things in Pandaria took so long before they were nerfed, or at least balanced down. Not completely just destroyed to the ground, but balanced down at least. Druids were also really cool back in MoP. I remember Symbiosis, and I remember it because I played a Druid at the beginning of Mists of Pandaria. I remember playing Boomkin, and I hated Incarnation for Boomies. I hated that it was a GCD, and I didn't like the direction Boomies were going, so I stopped. But back then, when I did play a bit of Resto, a bit of Boomy, and I also learned some of the different symbiosis abilities you had as a feral. Symbiosis would allow a druid to choose a member of the raid or party and share an ability while also getting one back, depending on your spec, but also depending on their class. So for a druid, you would have a different ability, maybe as a bear, feral, boomkin, or as a resto. But let's say you share an ability with a mage, no matter the spec of mage, unless they're a different role like a tank or a healer, they'll always have that one ability. So Blizzard want to make sure you have, so many abilities that everybody can have. I remember some of the broken combos, like Restoration Druids have an ice block. So in arenas, you would basically have to account, okay, he's going to go into bear, there's going to be Ursula's defense, there's going to be the bark skin, there's going to be iron bark, and then there's going to be ice block, which really was kind of a curveball for a lot of people, but everybody played around it. Some of the other ones that I remember, I don't really remember a lot with Boomkin. I don't remember a lot of abilities you could get. I remember you could give rejuvenation to Warlocks, you can give healing touch with 10-second cooldown to mages. I remember rogues would get this growl ability that made him like a pseudo tank, so rogue tanking back in Pandaria I guess might have been a thing, or an off tank for a short moment to help their tank. I guess it would have been good maybe like in challenge mode dungeons where you want to make sure the tank doesn't have the aggro the whole time, kind of rip it off him for like a second, give him breathing space. What else did we have? We also had Feral Spirits for Ferals. We had Redirect if you were to use it with a Rogue. So you had a lot of combos, and it was a lot to remember what was good and what wasn't. But it was always cool as a Druid to be able to share an ability with somebody else. And because Druids are so adaptable, having access to all 3 different roles to be a tank, healer, range DPS, or melee DPS, always felt it was cool for their class design and class playstyle. I remember Elemental Shamans being really cool, especially for PvP, slinging around meatballs all over the place. They were an easier spec, and it was an easier time, I feel like a simpler time, where you didn't have some crazy Earthshock damage or anything like that. It was mostly about the big old lava burst. I remember the ability of Ascendance though for all 3 specs, and I remember Enhanced with being able to literally global people in a one-shot, especially if you went for that crazy 2-hander build. I remember seeing videos of people actually one-shotting people left and right. That's what I will remember Mists of Pandaria for, is an expansion of one-shots. I also remember Frost Mages and how cool they were. I mean, you can get a Frost Mage cool, but I do remember making one back in Legion because of all those PvP videos I saw from back in Pandaria. I thought, wow, back in MoP they were so cool. They had a pretty cool mechanic where they would stun an enemy, and then every ability while they're stunned, since they're frozen, is technically a crit, so all 3 specs could be viable and were really strong. But mages were overpowered when you think about it back in the day. I mean, I feel like when I made my mage back in Legion, I wanted to be like a crazy Frost mage with so many slows, but Frost just ended up being like a 1v1 spec, probably not the best. I feel like mages for PvP in Legion actually weren't that great. At least for me. I remember so many people saying, oh no, they were great, they were overpowered, but I don't remember. I remember just trying to combine some crazy wombo combo burst, and unless you were a fire mage with greater pyro, I don't really remember doing anything crazy. But I think the current BFA is closer to Mists of Pandaria mage. Like, Frost feels really good. Lots of crit, lots of slows, just lots of random damage out of seemingly nowhere. And then there was Warlocks. I remember them having a billion different abilities. I remember Warlocks in Mists of Pandaria had many different defensives, whether you're Affliction, whether you're Destruction. Like, was Destruction able to heal themselves back then? I know they were able to heal themselves back in WoD, but I'm pretty sure they could also heal themselves back in MoP. I believe there was even a glyph that allowed you to heal for a little bit more, but over time. Is that how I'm remembering right? I remember watching a lot of Cobrak from back in the day. Even though I don't remember Destruction Warlocks from back then, I remember Cobrak, and I remember him just destroying everybody left and right. Cobrak movies were available back then too, like Cobrak 17, the one that has like 1 million views. And that was amazing. I thought they were probably in the best spot they ever could be. A mix of Chaos Bolts, but a mix of a few instacast abilities, and Affliction I felt like was very interesting. I remember even Demonology eventually becoming a really good one-shot wombo combo spec, but it was again very wombo combo. It wasn't a spec where you could deal good sustained damage, you just kind of had a big lineup once you had enough resources and cooldowns, and you could literally obliterate somebody in a few globals. It was that kind of a spec. Oh, and last thing I remember is Shadow Priest being able to spam DP or something along those lines. I remember people were getting DP'd in BGs. And yes, I do mean they were getting Death Plague, but also it did feel like a DP. The only thing I don't remember about Mists of Pandaria all that well is the raiding environment. I remember raiding for the first 3 raids, and that's where my attention just kind of disappeared, because I was raiding as a druid at the time. And I kind of like the raids, I like being able to raid, but eventually all the guilds I was in either moved or stopped playing that early, so I just started playing my rogue. And since then, PvP has been the thing that I always wanted to do, and I just did. I didn't really do that much with Siege of Argamar. I didn't really do that much with Throne of Thunder. I do remember having to wait about a year of same raid of Siege of Argamar before we even got anything close to a release of Warlords or General, or even anything about it on BlizzCon. So there's a good part of the gameplay that I simply wasn't there for, but I do know that in raids, Fury Warriors were really strong. I remember Hunters were really good, Mages were generally good, Rogues had a place, and I believe Assassination was the spec that a lot of people played. That or old school combat, I can't remember. I remember tanks being pretty good. I remember Brewmaster tanks were so good you can actually ignore certain mechanics because of their whole playstyle between the ability of Guard, which is a huge absorb that also increase how much healing you do, and your mechanic for Stagger, where you would stagger off the damage. I don't really know how it all works. I don't know enough to give you guys a detail. I just remember that people would skip certain boss fight and certain mechanics in such a way where it made difficult fights really easy until Blizzard curbed that into the ground. And honestly, that's all I remember of Mists of Pandaria. It was a great expansion, and I remember enjoying it tremendously, although I mostly did PvP for majority of the expansion, and most of the times I was just trying to break 2k as a combat rogue, which I did, and I was super happy about. But I also remember it being an expansion where a lot of my friends just left, a lot of people just stopped playing, and I don't really know how I feel about it. I know that a lot of the classes had a very rocky start at the beginning, so if people are talking about class design back in MoP, we do need to remember they started out pretty bad at the beginning. It took a while for them to get close to balanced to and equal to one another towards the end of the expansion, but it was towards the end where there was like nothing to do in terms of content for a whole year, I believe. So Mists of Pandaria is always going to have a soft spot for me because that's where I started playing back as my combat rogue. This is my journey when I started playing rogue. So I'm always going to enjoy the zones as well. I feel like Jade Force is always going to be in my top 5. The music of Mists of Pandaria, the story, the art style was pretty great, and the fight to defeat Garrosh at the end, I thought it was just fitting. I thought it was really cool in terms of the themes of it. But as an expansion and in terms of class design, I don't think it was perfect. I think it eventually got to a more leveled feel by the end of it, but it was definitely not perfect. Honestly, I feel that BFA is at a state where it has a pretty clean slate, and Blizzard talked about this before themselves. They wanted to make the game a little more clean slate where they can kind of start with a lot of classes from scratch. They can start them new and bring in newer models, similar to what they got for Demon Hunters, where it's still the same class with the archetype of you're a fast mobile class, but the talents kind of allow you different playstyle, different choices. Maybe bring back basic abilities, a lot similar to how we have Hibernate, Soothe, and a lot more back into the game, back into the fold to make it a lot more interesting. Bringing back Raid Boss was an interesting way of going about it. Given certain classes a debuff that they can apply to an enemy also is a pretty good way for going about it. We also have classes with threat management for rogues and hunters. We have classes with dispels and soothe to de-enrage enemies. So that's a good step in the right direction, and I feel like we need more of that. Blizzard can take a look at certain classes, like Warrior for example, and try to find out if abilities like Heroic Strike from back in the day, if it's necessary. Do we need it? Is it actually going to do something for the gameplay? And find maybe new abilities, come up with brand new spells to add to the playstyle in order to refresh a lot of these characters. A lot of classes have old archetypes from previous expansions, and I feel like those archetypes won't work for too long, because if you try to keep them in the old archetypes of, like, you know, the same cast, the same spells, the same combos that they had forever and ever and ever, you're not really going to go anywhere forward. You gotta find fresh new takes at certain classes that have been around already, and add new and interesting ability interactions for those classes. Maybe even certain abilities that are unique, that are niche, that not a lot of classes are going to be using, like Sunder Armor for back in the day, or Feral Druids maintaining Fury Fire on a boss. Stuff like this, little things for your class that you did way back in previous expansions, but find similar small things, but not exactly the same mechanics, but give classes small roles to play in raids, in dungeons, in PvP. Smaller roles where they're not just there just to do damage. Something extra that they do, something more that they bring to the team. And I feel like that alone can make the whole playstyle and the discussion of class design, and I feel like it'll be also healthy for future BFA going forward. Anyway guys, this is my video on Mists of Pandaria class design versus BFA stuff, and just me kind of taking a memory lane trip back to Mists of Pandaria on the good things and the weird stuff that they've done in the past. So let me know your thoughts, guys, in the comments below. Would you like for Blizzard to completely stop where they're at with BFA and go back to Mr. Pandaria class design? Like if they were to just remove all the classes right now, bring back all the classes and class design back in Mr. Pandaria, that means no more Outlaw rogues, only combat rogues? Or do you think that they should just take what they have right now in BFA and just kind of upgrade forward? And in what direction do you think they should take the game as well? Let me know the thoughts in the comments below, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.